It is Friday and snowing in Washington, D.C., but the duck on my mug looks warm, so I'm just going to put on my ulukakui and lean into the warm delusion. Happy Friday, everybody. I'm Brino, and this is the Aloha Friday Morning Report on the federal courts for December 5th, 2025. Double tap your screen, comment how you're staying warm, and watch the first minute or so, even if you're coming back later, so we hit the FYP. Become a paid subscriber or super fan to help me keep going, and check the link in my bio so I can keep doing this. I sat through a fascinating hearing yesterday about the Trump administration's ability to decide who is funded based on their, quote, liberal bias. So stick around and I will get to that in a minute. But first, hold on to your coffee, and let's get to the news, shall we? All right. First, we're going to rip the Band-Aid off on this Texas redistricting Supreme Court situation. Yesterday, the Supreme Court stayed a lower court decision in Abbott v. LULAC, enjoining the use of the new Texas redistricting maps. The lower court found that these maps were redistricted based along racial lines and overturned them based on the Voting Rights Act. The Supreme Court felt they were pretty clearly done for purely partisan reasons and stayed that decision for now, but it'll likely be stayed long enough that it won't matter for 2026. So, let's start out with a couple legal principles. First, there's an old quote that all redistricting is gerrymandering, which I think is just an interesting place to start. Second, when you have to redistrict, there's an idea that you should only do it with a very basic census data in front of you. How many people are there? How old are they? That should be your main question. No data on who they are or their voting habits, just are they allowed to vote? And I think that may be the best idea. But finding people without ulterior motives to draw up maps is probably tough. And then third, we look at the bad kind of gerrymandering as being 1, along partisan lines, trying to help a party win, or 2, along racial lines, trying to diminish the voting power of a racial group. And historically, the court has been way more willing to intervene in racial gerrymandering than political gerrymandering. Now, there have been attempts by the court over the years to find a way to constitutionally fix partisan gerrymandering. None of them have been very successful. And I don't want to get into this too far, it's a big rabbit hole, but it's a good rule of thumb that the court is unlikely to intervene in partisan gerrymandering. And considering how blatantly the Republican Party made this about ensuring that Republicans picked up more seats in the House, yesterday the court said that at least on a quick review for a stay, it looked more like partisan redistricting. Now, I've done this dive several times. I'm not going to do it right now, but I have read the exhaustive work that the Senate did back in 1982 on the Voting Rights Act to create a standard for determining whether race was a factor when drawing a new map. And the Senate determined that looking to the intent of lawmakers was a bad idea. They were very, very clear about that. So I am a little disappointed that the Roberts Courts has adopted this new standard of what they call legislative goodwill in these cases. Because they have been instructed by Congress not to imply any will at all, good or bad, when they use this law. But until someone gives me a robe, no one's going to listen to me anyway, so it is what it is for now. To be clear, I wouldn't expect California's map to be overturned either. That case had a way tougher road than this one. I think it's dead in the water. Okay, next. A grand jury in Norfolk, Virginia refused to bring a new indictment against Letitia James yesterday. First set of charges were dismissed because Lindsay Halligan, who brought the charges, was determined to be improperly appointed. And the department is pretty embarrassed, so they're trying to relaunch charges as quickly as possible. A grand jury only has to find probable cause to bring an indictment. It's not a very high bar, but particularly with how well known this case has become, it's going to be hard for the DOJ to find a grand jury who doesn't already know what's happening here. No matter what case they present to the jury, there's a jury nullification issue that they have to deal with. So even if a grand jury might find probable cause under normal circumstances, they may not want to in this case because they think it's unjust. And that's part of why we require a grand jury as a screener in there. The Constitution requires, we the people get a voice in how our criminal laws are executed, and this is that voice. Now, DOJ can bring a misdemeanor charge without a grand jury indictment, and that's what they had to do when they failed to secure an indictment with the sandwich guy. So if the DOJ suddenly celebrates a misdemeanor indictment, just be aware of what that means. All right. Yesterday, I sat in on a hearing in NPR v. Trump, and this is a case about whether the government can make funding decisions based on the viewpoints of private actors. Yesterday, each side had a motion on the table that they wanted to be considered, basically a motion to close this case out one way or another. The government said to close the case because all the issues are now resolved. The plaintiffs, NPR and some radio stations, said to find that the government had violated the First Amendment and close the case by ordering the government to do some stuff. So we're going to go through those arguments, but I'm going to start with a little background. back in May, Donald Trump passed an executive order called Ending Taxpayer Subsidization of Biased Media, which ordered the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, also called CPB, and more broadly any federal agency, to stop funding NPR. And just to unwind the parties here, you have radio stations all over the country, independent public radio stations. A lot of them are associated with universities. And they have 24 hours to fill, so they usually play a combination of whatever they produce themselves and radio shows that they might buy from other companies, like NPR. NPR is a company here in DC that makes radio shows, including news updates, music shows, and they sell them to those radio stations. All Things Considered, Tiny Desk Concert, those kind of shows. They were formed by the government, and they're linked to the government, but they're an independent company. And CPB, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, is another independent company that, among other things, provides part of the funding that keeps NPR running. It also sends grant money to these little stations. This is not CBP, Customs and Border Patrol, but there's a 30 to 60% chance that I'll keep saying it backwards anyway. Now, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting was defunded this past year. All of their money was cut off, but we'll get back to that in a minute. Point here is that NPR, CPB, and your local stations are totally different companies. They have connections to each other, but they're different, okay? So there was this executive order that mostly had two operational sections. Section 2 ordered the CPB to stop funding NPR. Section 3 ordered all other federal agencies to stop funding NPR. And a lot of the government's argument to close the case sort of broke down along those lines, so I'll break them down along similar lines. Okay, we're going to start with CPB. CPB redirected some funding from NPR to somebody else, arguably because the executive branch told them to. And there were also some other issues with CPB in the executive order. Well, a few weeks ago, CPB agreed to sign a settlement with NPR to give them that money back and to not abide by the executive order anymore, because, again, they're not a government agency and they don't have to follow the executive order. And the DOJ opted not to be part of that negotiation or that settlement. But DOJ argues that when NPR and CPB signed that settlement, that was basically the end of this lawsuit. It should be dismissed. It's now moot. Now, there are a couple of problems with that. First, Section 3 of the executive order still exists, the part about all the other agencies. The government says, oh, but those agencies don't really fund NPR. But some of those little NPR stations that we think of get government grants from other agencies. In fact, one of the stations that's a plaintiff in this case is located out near a reservation and just got a big grant from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. If the radio station wants to use that money to, say, buy NPR programming, like All Things Considered, they're worried they'll lose their grant because Section 3 of the EO may ban the Bureau of Indian Affairs from funding NPR in any way, even through an independent station. But even just the CPB part of Section 2 may still be a problem. Government lawyers said CPB has agreed to this settlement, so Section 2 of the EO was no longer an issue. Also, CPB is basically dead. It's been defunded, so either way, there's nothing left here to argue about. But the judge said two things. First, CPB isn't dead. It still exists, it just doesn't have any money. CPB was created by statute, so the executive branch can't just pretend it doesn't exist anymore just because they've taken money away from it. That's not how the law works. And the judge says there's no guarantee that President Trump won't change his mind tomorrow, replace the whole board of CPB with Stephen Miller and Pete Hegseth and who else, and tell them to stop following the settlement. And then the judge just kept backing the lawyer into a series of corners, because the judge kept trying to use arguments that go against the Trump administration policy, and the judge would say, okay, you want to agree with that on the record? And the lawyer did not. So, like, CPB members can't be removed by the president because it's not an executive agency. But the president believes he can remove anybody. Do you want to agree on the record that the president can't do that? No? Okay. The CPB has agreed to this settlement, so there's no harm to NPR, right? But the president doesn't believe that this binds the entire federal government. Do you want to agree on the record that the entire federal government is bound by this settlement? And I'm quoting here, because then we can all go home. No? Well, okay then. This back and forth went on for quite a while. Basically, end of the day, this settlement with CPB is worth about the toilet paper it's written on as far as the administration is concerned, and the court was not about to moot the whole case on a castle made of toilet paper tubes. And the last reason the case can't just be closed is that once a case is found to have standing, way back at the beginning of the case, the plaintiff is entitled to complete relief. So just because the plaintiff got relief in part of the case, just because that part is important in finding standing in the first place, doesn't mean the standing's gone. Not how the law works. Once you get over the standing hump, doesn't have to revisit it over and over again, it's already there. So, doesn't look like the government's request to just close this case is going to fly. Let's look at the plaintiff's argument real fast. That was mostly about the First Amendment. Now, they want the court to declare this executive order unconstitutional, somehow order the government not to enforce it, which is complicated, but let's focus on the law. Sorry, need a little coffee. Okay, first, you have government speech. Hi, I'm the government. I'm speaking. Government has a lot of control over what it says when it's actually speaking. But after some back and forth, it was pretty much agreed that this was not actual government speech. This was the government funding a private actor who was in turn speaking. Government is really restricted in deciding who it funds based on what they say. If the government decides who it wants to fund based on the content of someone's speech, this is called content discrimination. It's a pretty broad category. Might include like what style of music a band plays. So if the government says, oh no, we're not giving any grants to country music artists, that could be content discrimination, and they may get into some trouble for that. But there's a subset of content discrimination called viewpoint discrimination. That's where the government says, oh no, we're not giving grants to any Republican music artists. Now that is viewpoint discrimination, and that's an absolute no-no. It's a way stricter standard. Now honestly, sometimes the two get confused. We tend to learn them together as law students, and I think the government lawyer here got in trouble because he didn't do his homework for this case where it was going to be really important. So in the hearing yesterday, government attorney kept citing cases about content discrimination to justify the executive order. After being pressed repeatedly on the point, he finally said, well, aren't we walking a really fine line between content discrimination and viewpoint discrimination? And the judge was like, absolutely not. When the government is deciding how to spend its money on private actors, viewpoint discrimination is an extra level of no-no. So then the DOJ attorney tried to say, well, this wasn't viewpoint discrimination. But as the judge pointed out, the name of the EO was ending taxpayer subsidization of biased media. So it was right there in the title. Well, then the attorney said, the intention here was to get us out of the business of paying for any biased media at all, anything with a political bent. And NPR and CPB were defunded because they were seen as left-leaning. The government wants to get out of the business of funding anyone with a political bias. So the judge said, can you point to a right-leaning organization that has also been defunded? Crickets. I cannot, said the lawyer. So the judge said, so what you're saying is basically we're going to stop paying salaries of Democratic members of Congress because we want to get out of the business of funding salaries for members of Congress, which got a good laugh. Particularly because NPR in this EO claiming to end subsidization of biased media it's written to only apply to NPR, nobody else. So it just didn't work. Last thing, defense attorneys cited Donald Trump's tweets about how awful NPR was, and the government tried to say, well, those are just tweets. They're not real law. They're not executive orders. But the judge said, yeah, but Trump sent a 3 a.m. tweet to Pam Bondi, and the next day Letitia James was indicted. It's kind of hard to argue that tweets aren't official communications. Anyway, we'll see how all this plays out. Should get an answer in a couple of weeks. I'll let you know what the judge says. Okay, that is your Aloha Friday Morning Report. Thank you, Michelle, for becoming a paid subscriber over on the Stacks. Austin, thank you for the Venmo support. Check out the link in my bio if you like what I do and want to keep me going. Mahalo and fa'afatai for watching, everybody. Stay warm. Manawia leaso. Have a great weekend.